Today on the Locked On Blues podcast, the St. Louis Blues trade rumors are heating up with Torey Krug being apparently shopped by the St. Louis Blues, as well as Vladimir Tarasenko apparently has not rescinded his trade request and would still like to move on. So both of those guys are being shopped right now by the St. Louis Blues. We're talking about that. Plus, the NHL draft is tomorrow night. Good friend Gabe Foley helped me out, compile some names that the Blues are going to be looking at. So second half of the episode, I'm going to be going over a couple guys that I think the Blues might be looking at taking at the 23rd pick in the NHL draft. Busy episode, lots to talk about. Make sure you stay tuned.
You're Locked On Blues, your daily podcast on the St. Louis Blues. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Locked On Blues podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, and your number one source for daily Blues content. I'm your host, Josh Hyman. Like I said, I got a very busy episode for you today. So want to thank you guys out there for making Locked On Blues your first listen. Podcast is free and available on all podcast platforms. So appreciate you guys making me a part of your daily routine, especially now. You know, it's been a little boring the past week and a half or so before like the free agency and draft is starting to heat up. So this is a really exciting time in the off season, you know, with the draft tomorrow, free agency right around the corner. Things are going to be changing left and right. You know, all that talk of, we just got to wait and see. Well, it's finally paying off. We're going to be seeing what the Blues plans are. And those plans apparently might involve trading Torey Krug. Now, before I get into that talk, I do want to talk about Vladimir Tarasenko because Frank Cervelli tweeted something out that I thought was a little interesting, kind of just snuck it in there, and it didn't raise a ton of alarm. He recently updated. He has a trade bait list on TSN. I recommend you guys checking it out. If you just look up NHL trade bait list, it's got the list of names. But two Blues players were added to that trade list recently. One of them at number 5, one of them at like number 12. You know, of terms of top trade assets in the entire league. And at number 5 is Vladimir Tarasenko. Now the tweet read something like, Vladimir Tarasenko has not rescinded his trade request and would still like to move on. So, I mean, that's kind of surprising to me. I think I was under the assumption that maybe he hadn't like officially rescinded his trade request, but he was happy here. He'd be happy playing out the remainder of, but that's not the case. And you know, as good of a season as he had, as quiet of a season he had in terms of the trade rumors and the drama, it sounds like Tarasenko's trade request is still just as important to him as it was last offseason. You know, he hasn't changed his mind, and that complicates things. You know, I think I have had talked about in the past, and a couple people on Twitter and stuff had talked about in the past, moving Tarasenko for a top 4 defenseman or something like that, regardless of the trade request status, just because, you know, you got a lot of money on the books for players, and you got to shed cap somewhere. And Vladimir Tarasenko seemed like somewhat of an obvious choice. You know, hasn't quite been himself since the injuries sort of disappeared in the playoffs here and there. But the fact that he still is asking the Blues to honor his trade request makes that pretty simple. There's not much to talk about here that I didn't talk about and Tommy didn't talk about, you know, forever ago when the initial trade request happened. Not much has changed. The goals are still the same for the Blues, I think, if you're trading Vladimir Tarasenko. I don't think it would be a sort of move where they would try to be trading up in the draft. I saw people talking about like, oh yeah, you know, Ottawa's shopping their number 7 pick or whatever. I don't think that's something that the Blues would do. I just don't think it fits in with their timeline, trading one of their roster players into the top 10, or to get into the top 10, I should say. I think the more likely thing we would see for Tarasenko would be a hockey trade, you know, just him for a defenseman or something like that. And it's going to be tough because it's the same issues that you ran into last year where, I mean, I guess he's proved himself more. You know, you don't have to worry about the injury risk or the worry about the potential decline due to injuries. You know what you're getting out of Vladimir Tarasenko, but you know, that no trade clause that he has make things difficult. He has to agree to where he's being sent, I believe. Let me just double check here that he does have a no trade clause. But yeah, I mean, it's the same issues with the trade that existed, you know, last offseason. It's yeah, he has a full no trade clause, so he'd have to pick where he wanted to go, and that makes it so he has a little bit more leverage than maybe the Blues would be comfortable with, and that's why I don't think a move would be super imminent, because they got to find the right package, and they also need to find the right package with the right team. If you remember a couple years ago when the Blues were shopping Kevin Shattenkirk, they were all ready to go to trade him to the Edmonton Oilers for Taylor Hall, which would have been nuts, but Kevin Shattenkirk declined to sign an extension with Edmonton, so the trade fell through. So you got to wonder how many trades like that are going to, almost happen that we don't hear about because Vladimir Tarasenko uses his no trade clause to nix the trade. So it's going to be a waiting game. I think, again, I don't think it's going to be something that happens, on draft night or anything like that, but it definitely is something that I think we should keep an eye on. And something that's pretty disappointing. I think a lot of Blues fans had a change of heart on Tarasenko and really wanted him to stick around for a long time after this season, and forgiven him and welcomed him back with open arms. And now that he's still asking to be traded, it's frustrating and it's sad. But if that's what he wants, the Blues have to make the best of that, and hopefully trade him for some assets that are going to help them in the short term and the long term. I'll probably get into that more after the draft and stuff, because I think that's likely what's going to happen. But speaking of trades, the Blues are also apparently shopping Torey Krug. So in the second segment, before I get into the draft, I'm going to be talking about that. If you guys have any sort of bets that you were thinking about making, though, if you got a hot take for next year's NHL Stanley Cup champion or anything like that, you got to put your money where your mouth is at betonline.net. Now, betonline.net is your number one source for all your betting needs and sports info. You can find all the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news, including Major League Baseball, NHL, all that fun stuff. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sporting wagering information, including live betting, esports, and scores. And betonline.net remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. betonline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite sports and events, including MMA, boxing, and golf. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. Bet online where the game starts. I'll be right back with the second half of today's episode. All right, so along with the Vladimir Tarasenko news also came another small piece of news that seemingly just got tweeted out without much drama, much fanfare, and that's the Blues are looking at trading away Torey Krug. Now, Torey Krug is in the same boat as Vladimir Tarasenko. He does have a no-trade clause, so all the things that I talked about in the last segment with the difficulties of trading Vladimir Tarasenko exist with Torey Krug, plus the fact that Torey Krug is an aging, undersized defenseman making $6.5 million for 4 more years. That is difficult enough to get rid of. The flip side of that, however, is that Torey Krug is a pretty darn good defenseman, and he's been really good with the Blues so far. I think what the Blues have in mind, I think it's pretty apparent, is that they believe that Scott Perunovich can come in and fill the role for Torey Krug, whether it's on the power play or, even 5-on-5. I think that they see Scott Perunovich as sort of a very similar mold to Torey Krug and just assume that he can do the same things, which makes sense, and at the same time, you also don't necessarily want 2 5'9", 5'10" smaller defensemen on your roster necessarily, unless they're really, really good, because that can be an exploit that is used against you by your opponents, is having undersized defensemen. It can be difficult to play defense with those guys. Torey Krug doesn't kill penalties. Scott Perunovich doesn't kill penalties. That really narrows your options in terms of what you're going to do with the rest of your defense if you have both of ththose guys out there. So from a logistical standpoint, I think it makes a lot of sense that the Blues want to go younger there. But at the same time, it brings the question, like, what exactly could the Blues get for Torey Krug? They just signed him. I mean, not just signed him, but he's relatively new addition to the team. Only a third of the way into his contract, still has 4 years left at $6.5 million with a no trade clause, and he is getting up there in age. You wonder who the potential suitors might be, and you wonder if Torey Krug wants to go to a contending team, because he has that whole no trade clause, which I assume he would want to go to a contending team, because it's not like he can choose to get more money or anything like that. His contract is already set. This is a trade. This isn't free agency, and he has a no trade clause. So if he has a say, which he does, I would assume he would want to go to a contending team. And how many contending teams out there are in the market for an undersized defenseman on the wrong side of 30 with 4 years left on a $6.5 million deal? Maybe not that many, unfortunately. As good as Torey Krug is, I think the worry is there that when he begins his decline, it's going to be kind of ugly just because he relies a lot on his speed and his athleticism and stuff that, might take a hit as he gets up in age. But the flip side of that is he looks like he hasn't lost a step at all with the Blues in the past 2 years. Or besides that injury that he suffered in the playoffs, we'll see how he's able to recover from that. But I don't know. I think it's going to be interesting to see what the market might be on Torey Krug. It makes a lot of sense for the Blues to trade him, but at the same time, it's frustrating because I feel like when the Blues gave out that contract initially, as much as like I liked it and a lot of people liked it, I think the worry was what happens in the second half of that contract when all of a sudden he starts to regress a little bit and that money is looking like a little too much. What's happening? And it's like, you can't just trade your way out of every bad contract you give out. You can't get lucky and dump Patrick Berglund into the Buffalo Sabres every single time that you make a mistake in terms of signing a guy. Now, is Torey Krug similar to Patrick Berglund, or even a better example, Jori Lehtera? No, he's much, much better than those guys. And the contract isn't as much of an albatross as those guys. It's not like it's something that felt untradeable or just absolutely crippling. Like Torey Krug is still, as of right now, as of last season, worth the money. But it's just like, could that money be better allocated somewhere else? I think the answer is yes. I think the Blues know that the answer is yes, and therefore they're looking to trade him. So it's going to be interesting to see what they do, in the coming days. At the same time, in the same vein as Tarasenko, I don't think Torey Krug would be a draft night trade. I think that would be something that they sort of work on over the offseason and, kind of wait for the perfect deal to come together. I don't know. We'll see. It's going to be interesting. Gives a lot of buzz, a lot of things to talk about here on the podcast over the coming days, coming weeks, or who knows, maybe in typical fashion, one of them will be traded the second I finish recording this episode, who knows? So that being said, though, there is an NHL entry draft coming up tomorrow night at 7. Round 1 begins 7 o'clock Eastern. And I reached out to Gabe Foley at NHL Foley on Twitter. If you guys don't follow him, you're missing out. He is a mega mind, super genius when it comes to prospects. He knows everything about everyone in the first round and beyond. He's come up with a ton of mock drafts. He's written articles. He's done great work. And, I haven't had as much of a chance to follow the NHL draft as much this year as in years past. So I reached out to Gabe. I said, hey, man, give me some help. Give me some tips. Who you think the Blues are looking at? What do they compare to in terms of NHL players and stuff? So he sent me a list of a couple players with some NHL comparisons. I'm going to be talking about that and why I think that could be a great fit on the St. Louis Blues. Huge shout out to Gabe. If you're listening, I really appreciate it. You're saving me a lot of time, a lot of headache. And if you guys are listening at home, check him out if you're interested in prospects at all. He does great, great work on his Twitter at NHL Foley on Twitter. Anyways, the first name that he mentioned, well, the first, I guess, type of player he mentioned was big centers. And I like a big center for the St. Louis Blues. That is a role that has been a constant for them, in years past. Ryan O'Reilly, of course, is a great example. They loved Tage Thompson in the draft. Obviously, he didn't pan out in the way that they wanted initially. But they just love their big brooding centers that can, play both ends of the ice and play well. And the first name that Gabe sent me, hopefully I can pronounce all these right because this year's draft has some funky names. Nathan Gaucher is the first name that he mentioned. And he says Nathan Gaucher is a big center, like I said, but shifty in his movement, so he's a little bit quicker. Heard him compared to Rob Niedermeyer, which is a great comparison as any player. I mean, if the Blues draft the player and you tell me they're going to turn to Rob Niedermeyer, I am psyched. So a big center, but not slow by any means, able to, play both ends of the ice. I would like that a lot. I wouldn't be surprised to see the Blues go after someone like that. Another name in a similar vein is Philip Bystedt, something like that. 6'4" center, but a lot quicker than you might realize. He's flashy player. He can be the best player on a line, but he's also tough. He's big, he's tall. I asked Gabe NHL player comparison. He said Brian Boyle, which I love. he's had a slightly more skilled Brian Boyle, which that's a huge compliment. I think Brian Boyle is a great player. He's a big, tall, brooding center that can protect the puck like it's nobody's business and play great hockey on both ends of the ice. But Bicep also has a little bit of flash, a little bit of skill, a combination of that tall, gritty center, but can also be the best offensive player on a line. I would love to see them go after a guy like that. Another defense first center that Gabe mentioned is Philip Mesar. Well-rounded, very strong, strong on his stick, strong on the puck. Very hard to get the puck off his stick, similar to Bicep, similar to like that last comparison I talked about with Brian Boyle. Defensive first guy with offensive potential. He gave Saku Koivu as his player comparison. Shout out to Gabe coming up with these obscure but spot on player comparisons. I was expecting him to, be like, oh yeah, this guy, he's Patrice Bergeron, he's Anze Kopitar, David Pastrnak. I don't know, just typical star names, but he's reaching into the depths of old NHL players and old towns and giving me really detailed answers. So if the Blues are looking for more of a defensive first center rather than the first two, which are kind of just two-way guys with maybe a little bit leaning towards offense, they would go after a guy like Philip Mesar, who's got that great defensive potential, but also a boost in his offense a little bit more than typical defense first guys. I would like that as well. Now, moving on to the defensive prospects, he mentioned two. The first one was Matthias Havled, speedy defenseman, similar, I guess, in a vein to Torey Krug, Scott Perunovich, that sort of guy. A little bit bigger, though, obviously. Going to get you a ton of points, similar to Thomas Chabot, Eric Brandstrom, that sort of thing. Pushes perimeter play, pushes the pace. He's very quick. He's very flashy. Sort of an opposite style for what the Blues traditionally go for at defense, but similar to how they're approaching their defense lately with, guys like Torey Krug, Scott Perunovich, etc. And, guys like Cale Makar that are sort of redefining what it means to be a defenseman in the NHL. I would personally love to see the Blues go after a guy like Havled. I think he would be a kind of a potentially a franchise altering pick. If you can get a guy at the defensive position that can create offense as well as, a Cale Makar, which this isn't to say that Havled would be Cale Makar, but even Thomas Chabot, Eric Brandstrom, just guys like that who are honestly almost more known for their offense than their defense, but are more than capable of playing good defense. I think that would do wonders for the St. Louis Blues. I think they've tried that with Torey Krug, and they're trying that with Scott Perunovich, but those guys just don't quite have the defensive acumen just yet. I think Perunovich will get there, but still, if they can get a guy that has a two-way ability in the defensive end and the offensive end, I would absolutely love to see that. The last name that he mentioned is Noah Warren, big, strong defenseman, great in the defensive zone. He said he needs to improve his decision-making, and he said literally Colton Parayko. So if the Blues go out and draft a Colton Parayko replacement, as much as I hate to say the word replacement, I think that would make a lot of sense. They love big, tall players, especially at the defensive position. In the year that they won the cup, their average height of defenseman was like 6'3", 6'4", crazy stuff like that. But yeah, I think that would be a perfect fit as well. Colton Parayko is a very good defenseman. He's had flashes in the past of looking like a true number one defenseman. Obviously, has yet to really turn into the guy that Blues fans, including myself, are hoping he would be. But that doesn't mean that his positives, seeing the best parts of Colton Parayko in another player would be great. If you can get a guy that has Colton Parayko's skill set and is, a lot younger and projects of being, a solid defenseman similar to Parayko, I think you are all over that in the first round. Now, in this upcoming third segment, I'm going to be talking about one more prospect that I think is pretty interesting. Gabe told me a funny story about, so I'm going to be talking about that in this upcoming third and final segment. Make sure you stay tuned. All right. So lots of draft talk, lots of names being thrown out. Gabe Foley did send me a pretty interesting story here about one final prospect that he thought was a bit of a sleeper option for the St. Louis Blues to potentially pick. And I'm going to try to pronounce this name off the bat because I don't know if I'm going to be able to. All right, first name I can do. Ivan. Last name Miroshnichenko. Ivan Miroshnichenko. Okay, so you might be thinking, who? Now, there's a couple interesting things with this prospect. First of all, got diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma this season. I do remember hearing about that a couple months ago. Made a full recovery, cleared to play again, which that's awesome. That's just an amazing story right off the bat. Really heartwarming, really great to see. I do remember hearing about that story a couple months ago of the top touted prospect diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma. Questions on whether he would ever be able to play again, but he has been able to play and he has been cleared. But due to that, his draft stock has dropped a little bit, unfortunately, but understandably. And then also, all the deal with Russia and potentially not letting players back overseas, that crazy sort of thing that Kirill Kaprizov is doing right now is affecting Miroshnichenko as well. Typically Russian prospects will stay over in the KHL for a couple seasons after they get drafted. Tarasenko did that. But because of all this crazy stuff going on in Russia, where players are worried that if they go over to Russia, they won't be able to get their work visa and come and play in the U.S. Because of this, Miroshnichenko is probably staying in the U.S. After being drafted, which is a huge benefit for anyone picking him, because that's typically the biggest concern with picking Russian guys like Tarasenko, Kirill Kaprizov is, look what happened with Kaprizov. He was a hyped prospect for years, but didn't come over because he was playing in Russia, playing in the KHL. And now all of a sudden he's wanted by the Russian government for whatever reason. There's definitely reason for him to stay in the US. And also that could be reason to take a bit of a flyer on him. Reward him for obviously battling through his incredible recovery, but also, banking on the fact that he is staying in the United States could be huge. So if any one of those names get drafted, you heard it here first, but I heard it from Gabe Foley at NHL Foley on Twitter. Huge thanks to him for helping me out, giving me all those names. If you want to do research more on them, just reach out to me. I can tell you who the guys are. I can direct you to Gabe Foley, all that fun stuff. That being said, though, that is all the time I have for you today on the Locked On Blues podcast. So make sure you hit that follow or subscribe button on whatever podcast platform you're listening to me on. Subscribe to the YouTube channel at Locked On Blues. Hit the notification bell. That way, whenever a new video gets uploaded, you will be the first to know. Like I've been saying, 6 p.m. Eastern, audio platforms and YouTube podcast is going up at the same time, sort of getting into a daily routine, daily schedule. Hope you guys are enjoying that. Make sure you follow Locked On Blues on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok at Locked On Blues. Follow me on Twitter at Josh Hyman NHL. Thanks so much for listening. And as always, let's go Blues.